Yoimiya is back on banner, and a lot of people are finally getting their very first copy of her and ready to build her. And while she was received with some heavy criticism upon her initial release, she was still good then and is admittedly even better now with the introduction of some other characters. So let's go ahead and build her. Hi, my name's Blossums and welcome to another Genshin Impact video, and today we're going to be building Yoimiya, and she's still a really strong character. Yoimiya is a really good pyro DPS that just machine guns down bosses and has really good single target DPS. And today we're going to be going over her weapons, her artifacts, and her kit overall in general, some of the constellations, and we'll be talking about some different pairings with other characters that she's good with. But for team compositions as a whole, I'm going to be leaving that for a separate video and making a whole Yoimiya build team composition video. So stay tuned and subscribe to the channel around for that one, but we've got quite a bit to talk about, so let's go ahead and get into it. First up, let's talk about her kit, and Yoimiya is a main DPS pyro bow user, and she machine guns out pyro like no other. Her single target is extremely strong, and the majority of her damage is going to be coming from sort of her E skill, but kind of her normal attack. And what I mean is, well, her E skill, the way it works is when you cast it, it gives her a duration of Niwabi Ensho. And during that time, arrows fired by Yoimiya's normal attack will be blazing arrows, and their damage will be increasing converted to pyro damage. And then during that time, normal attack firework flare-up will not generate kindling arrows at charge level 2. We'll talk about that in just a second. Pretty irrelevant, honestly. And this does deactivate when she leaves the field, so when you activate it, you are committed. And the effect of her E-skill is that it increases her normal attack damage by 152% at level 7 here, and converts it to pyro. The duration here is 10 seconds and the cooldown is 8 seconds, which is a relatively longish cooldown, but it's actually kind of nice because it gives you plenty of time to go to your supports and actually use their elemental burst to then move back to her and deal all the damage all at once. So yeah, since this does pertain to your normal attacks, you can't ignore leveling up her normal attacks, and we'll talk about these too. And there's nothing too special here other than the fact she does have a second level to her charge attack, and this generates 3 kindling arrows that have very aggressive homing to them, but they don't really deal damage like at all. You'll see the modifier here is 26% per kindling arrow damage, so they're not very good, and their charge shot is okay at best, but the actual modifiers for attack string is important because this does have a sort of special internal cooldown to where she's almost certainly going to be vaporizing off of her first, third, and fifth hits. And this is important because her third and fifth hits are just so happen to be her strongest hits, so you're going to want to make sure that you actually get them off and finish her combo. And this is going to be very important for the majority of Yoimiya teams that are likely trying to vaporize to cause the most amount of damage. But other than that, she does have her elemental burst, and the way that this works is you jump up in the air, you cast it, you deal some AoE pyro damage, and then it marks one of the opponents, and then that mark is known as Aurora's Blaze. And whenever any other character on the team deals damage to the marked target, it's going to deal AoE pyro damage, and this doesn't apply to Yoimiya, by the way. So if she deals damage, it's not going to deal the AoE pyro damage. It has to be another unit, but off-field damage sources like Xingqiu's burst do count for this, so that's something to note as well. And when that opponent's defeated, it's actually going to pass on to another nearby opponent who will inherit the remaining duration, which is very nice. And an Aurora's Blaze detonation of the AoE pyro can happen every 2 seconds. And if she dies, then it goes away, so that's how that works. The initial damage there on the skill is pretty solid, but you'll see the Aurora's Blaze explosion damage is almost the same as the initial cast, and it's actually pretty good, and the damage on it does add up, so you can't really ignore the burst either, unless you're going to be using a certain artifact set that we'll discuss a little bit more in the artifact section. But her elemental burst is really strong, and I wouldn't ignore it unless you're going to be playing that way, and we'll talk about that when we get to the artifacts, because it is a little specific. It also has a duration of 10 seconds, which is nice, cooldown of 15, energy cost is 60, nothing too crazy here. Now her passives are also very important. Basically, the Niwabi Fire Dance, whenever you're using her E-skill and you do normal attacks, it's going to increase her pyro damage bonus by 2% on hit. And that's actually going to be able to stack up to 10 times, so you can get an increase of 20% pyro damage, which is very great. And this actually feeds into the next passive, which allows your elemental burst to bestow everybody else on your team 10% attack for 15 seconds. And additionally, you get an additional attack percent bonus based on the amount of stacks that you have from the previous passive. Each stack counts for 1% attack bonus, so you can get a maximum additional attack bonus of 10% since you can only get 10 stacks here, and you can bestow that to the rest of your team, ultimately increasing their damage. So ideally, you would deal as much damage as you can during Niwabi Fire Dance, cast your elemental burst at the end of it, buff your allies on your team so that they can deal more damage while you're setting up your next rotation for Yoimiya. And then our final passive here is just refund some materials whenever you create a decoration in the teapot or something like that. Nothing too crazy, but pretty nice overall. So the way Yoimiya works is obviously that she is a heavy pyro DPS damage dealer that machine guns out normal attacks as fast and as often as possible, hopefully reacting and dishing out a bunch of single target damage that way. She does lack a little bit in the AoE department, but her single target damage is pretty much unparalleled. It's extremely strong, and she can vaporize through bosses with ease. Next up, we'll talk about our artifacts, and while I think ultimately you're going to want Crimson Witch of Flames, and we'll talk about that in just a second, you do have some other options. Crimson Witch, of course, is going to be a great option, but Shiminawa's Reminiscence is going to be a phenomenal option as well, only if you're going to be using certain units. And what I mean by this is the way Shiminawa's works is you get 18% attack is nice, and then whenever you cast your elemental skill, it consumes 15 of your elemental burst energy and increases your normal charge and plunging attack damage by 50% for 10 seconds, which happens to be the same duration in which your elemental skill buff actually lasts. And this is very strong on Yoimiya because all of her damage is pretty much going to be coming from the normal attacks anyway, so making them deal more damage is very valuable, but she doesn't generate a ton of energy, so you're likely going to be missing quite a few of her elemental burst activations. And this is an issue because the elemental burst does, well, one, deal really solid damage, but two, it buffs your allies with attack percent like we talked about before. And although the damage on the burst is good, it actually doesn't compare to the Shiminawa's Reminiscence buff here, as long as you're not accounting for the attack percent buff to your allies. And what I mean by this is if you're using characters like Yunjin or Yelan or something, which are great pairings for Yoimiya here, and then the attack percent buff isn't really going to apply for them because Yunjin scales off defense and Yelan scales off of HP percent, so giving them more attack isn't really going to benefit them, and then at that point, something like the Shiminawa's Reminiscence is actually going to be better overall for your damage. But if you're using characters like Bennett or Kazuha or Xingqiu or something, then the attack percent is going to apply to them and is going to be important and increasing their damage overall, which would then put your overall damage to the enemy over Shiminawa's Reminiscence here. So that is important to note. You're going to want to know who you're pairing with Yoimiya here before you commit to something like Shiminawa's Reminiscence. And also the fact that you miss out on the elemental burst does kind of suck. It is a cool elemental burst, but it is quite finicky in all honesty. You're pretty likely to miss it because you jump up into the air and shoot downward, and if the enemy moves, and enemies move a lot, then you're likely going to miss, and that really sucks. And if you hate that aspect of the elemental burst, then I'd probably recommend this. But let's move back to Crimson Witch of Flames, and this is going to be a similar story as to my Diluc build video that I was talking about yesterday, where I think ultimately this is just going to be better. You get extra pyro damage bonus, you get a little bit increase in the overloaded damage and a little bit of increase in your vaporize and melt, but do note that this also increases your burning damage and is likely going to be changed in its text to increase whatever other dendro reactions this might have, wink wink nudge nudge. So this is still going to be a great option if you plan to put Yoimiya in some sort of dendro oriented team. Probably going to be the better option than something like Shiminawa's Reminiscence. And this isn't behind Shiminawa's Reminiscence in any way. As I mentioned before, it really is kind of team dependent on which artifact set is going to be better for you, but this one is just all around fantastic and isn't far behind Shiminawa's anyway in the first place. So I kind of recommend just this one overall. You also get the additional pyro there. I didn't read that last part there, but I did want you to consider the fact that this is going to be more applicable to dendro units when they come out in Sumeru, which is going to be very soon. And if you plan to put Yoimiya on those teams, then this is going to be the artifact set for you. Now, these aren't the only artifact sets you have to choose from. There are things like the Echoes of an Offering, which we'll come back to, and then there is something like the Retracing Bolide, which is also a phenomenal set for because you are likely going to be wanting a shield on your Yoimiya to make sure you're getting through her full combo, because otherwise you're using a lot of damage. Now back to Echoes of an Offering. This is actually a pretty good artifact set on her, but even if it's working properly, it still falls behind things like the Crimson Witch of Flames and the Shiminawas Reminiscence, so I can't really recommend it over those because you're more than likely going to have a better Shiminawas or a better Crimson Witch rather than a better Echoes of an Offering. But if you do have a really good version of this, it's a pretty solid set overall, but it does kind of work off of ping. If you have higher ping for some reason, you proc this more often and then it becomes better, which is really weird. But it's probably just better to shoot for something like Shiminawas or shoot for something like Crimson Witch of Flames overall because they are just better in general. But realistically, any of these 4-piece sets is going to come down to whatever you have the best substats on, because that's going to be pretty much the most important at the end of the day. And you can, of course, split pretty much any of these up with something like Crimson Witch of Flames and the Shiminawas. You could do Shiminawas and Gladiator or Shiminawas and Echoes and Offering, whatever. That all the split sets are fine realistically, and they're going to do pretty well, but I would try to shoot for one of these 4 sets if you can. And also wanted to touch back on Shiminawa's Reminiscence real quick because you might just be thinking, well, I'll just invest a little bit more in energy recharge on my substats and it'll be fine. I'll still get my elemental burst often, and that's not really the answer because you actually lose out on some of your damage potential from your other substats there, and then it becomes not worth it compared to the Crimson Witch. And but if you do just happen to have good energy recharge substats on a Shiminawa's piece already, and your set is just better than your Crimson Witch one, then go for it. It's still going to be better. Alright, enough about that. Let's talk about her main stats here, and it's very similar to the Diluc case, where you realistically have a very simple setup here for Yoimiya, but you do have a choice between something like attack percent or elemental mastery. And I think overall you should go attack percent, and I'll explain why. These are actually very close in damage, but remember, you're not going to be dealing all the reaction damage with your Yoimiya attacks. There's going to be plenty of attacks that are not reacting at all because of her internal cooldown, and then attack percent is going to, you know, show its face there. But Elemental Mastery does technically deal more damage if none of your reactions are interrupted, and I mean like none of them. If you have to dodge mid-combo like once or twice, then Elemental Mastery suddenly becomes not worth it and you should have just gone attack percent in the first place. So while both are fine, attack percent overall is just going to yield you better results, and looking for Elemental Mastery in the substats is going to be a better choice. But Elemental Mastery is interesting for those Vaporize and maybe those over-vape teams where you're trying to overload and vaporize, because Elemental Mastery works better with overload, so that's just something to consider as well. But other than that, the main stats are very simple. Pyro damage bonus on the goblet, attack percent if you don't have any pyro damage goblet, but crit rate and crit damage for the circlet, and those are all going to be the best choices for you there. And then when it comes to main stats, things you're going to want to be looking for are things like crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, and elemental mastery, and energy recharge where you can find it. You don't need much energy recharge. You only need about like 15, like 20-ish% to make sure you're consistently getting that elemental burst. But of course, the more the merrier, and if it just so happens to be with some good crit rate and crit damage, then that's fine too. In order of importance though, crit rate and crit damage definitely at the top. I would say next is probably Elemental Mastery, and then attack percent and energy recharge kind of at the bottom priority. Alright, let's talk about weapons. This is where things get kind of wacky and really cool, honestly. And the 5-star Thundering Pulse is going to be the best weapon overall for your Yoimiya. It's just a phenomenal weapon. I don't have it here, but if you have that, it's going to be really good. But other than that, your next best option is going to be the Rust, but only if you have it at R5, and we'll talk about some of the other refinements in a second, but Rust R5 is going to beat out every other 5-star than the Thundering Pulse there, so if you have it at R5, slap that on, you're good to go. But if you have things like Aqua Simulacra or Polar Star or Skyward Harp and Amos Bow, those are all fine. Amos Bow and Skyward Harp in particular are actually going to be worse than things like an R3 Rust, so if you have that, then I would go for R3 Rust over those as well. Just something to note there. And overall in the 4-star category, you don't have a ton of options. Things like the Hamayumi are fine. It's nothing fantastic, but it is definitely fine. Windbloom Ode is fine, but not really that good. I would definitely recommend trying to stick to the Rust if possible. But you do have one more option that actually compares to the Rust and potentially can beat the Rust, depending on your teammates, and that's actually going to be the slingshot. The 3-star bow can actually outpace the Rust's DPS, believe it or not. And that's because the passive on this is just so insane. You can get it at R5 very easily. It has a crit rate sub, which is actually very nice. But if you're using R5 slingshot and you don't have any buffs or anything, it's actually about on par with an R1 Rust. But the moment you add characters like Yunjin or Bennett, which are some of Yoimiya's best buffers in the game here, Slingshot suddenly becomes better than an R3 Rust, believe it or not, but is still below things like an R4 and R5 Rust. But if you use Yunjin and Bennett at the same time, R5 Slingshot actually becomes better than R5 Rust, which is pretty crazy, and that's actually a really cool part about it. So if you plan to use both of those characters, then something like the Slingshot's a really good option, but if you plan to use one of them, which I think you probably should, then it's going to compare to something like an R3 Rust, which is awesome. So if you just don't have any of these options available to you, and maybe you just haven't gotten the Rust on the gacha banner yet, Slingshot's probably going to be the best option overall for you. All right, let's briefly talk about some constellations, and she doesn't really have anything too crazy going on in the constellations. They're all fine. They add to her kit. They increase durations of like the elemental burst here, increase her attack, increase her pyro damage, which is nice. They reduce the cooldown of the E skill, and they added a chance for an additional arrow. So they're all nice, and they all help and make her deal more damage and stuff, and make her a little bit more consistent, but nothing is really gameplay changing for the most part. And she's overall a phenomenal unit without any of these constellations, and you're still going to be able to vaporize a ton of different stuff with her. All right, and now we'll briefly go over the stats on my Yoimiya, and then we'll move on to the next portion of the video here. I have her at 2000 attack. Do know I am currently in a pyro resonance, so I'm getting an additional 25%, so I'm cheating just a little bit there. But I do have 19 elemental mastery, which does kind of suck. I really want to try and get that up as much as I can, but I'm going to be waiting for, you know, potential Crimson Witch in the strong box, you know, wink wink. But other than that, I do have her at 65% crit rate, 144% crit damage, and 125 energy recharge, 61 pyro damage bonus here. I would like a little bit more crit rate to make her more consistent, because you do want to make sure that those first, third, and fifth hits are critting, and the more crit rate, the merrier at that point. And as I said, energy recharge, you only really need her at about 115 to 120 to make sure you're getting the burst consistently. So I'm sitting pretty well here. And as I said, the only way I'd really try to make this better is trying to get more elemental mastery where I can. And then beyond that, my talents are at 8, 7, and 8 here. And I wanted to touch back on the talents real quick because I forgot to mention this in the overview portion of the video, is that her E skill here, past level 6, you don't really need to level it up. It does increase your damage the more you level it up, but past level 6, you only get about a 3% increase. And you see that I did get like a 3% increase from when I went from like 6 to 7, but going from 7 to 8 is again like another 3%-ish increase there. So it becomes suddenly not really worth it to increase that, and you're better off increasing your normal attack and your elemental burst first. All right, now I'm briefly going to go over each and every one of the artifacts that I have on my Yoimiya, so you know how I got the stats that I have, and then we'll move on. All right, let's talk about some of the pairings that you're going to want to be doing with your Yoimiya here, starting off with the best buffs for her. Characters like Yunjin and Bennett are going to be the top buffers for your Yoimiya. Yunjin at C2 is actually comparable, if not a little bit better than Bennett in terms of buffing potential for the damage increase she provides, and Bennett is really good for her as well, especially since she's a ranged character and doesn't have to move out of the circle. And if you combine the both of them, well, you're doing extremely good damage, and they're both adding on and allowing her to deal a ton of damage. Kazuha is probably the next best buffer, only because if you have another pyro unit on the team, you can then swirl that pyro, and also he provides much needed crowd control because Yoimiya does not do a very good job at handling a ton of enemies at once, and Kazuha takes care of that whole thing, takes out all the trash mobs, and debuffs the big enemies while buffing your Yoimiya so that she can delete said big enemies. So they're actually a really good combo together as well. Yunjin and Bennett are the biggest damage increases for their given buffs, and together they're monsters in general, so that's a valid team comp as well. But these are the best buffers. As for some of the best off-field support characters for your Yoimiya, characters like Xingqiu and Yelan are of course going to be some of the best characters for Yoimiya to vaporize off of, and both of them together are phenomenal as well, as you could have guessed, because then your hydro application is just more consistent and she's more consistently vaporizing said hydro application. And then characters like Fischl are really strong, especially for overload based teams or over vape teams, and characters like Yelan and Fischl together are fine because then you're getting hydro and electro applied at the same time and then overloading and vaporizing both of those things there. But you can also pair a character like Beto here with like Yelan and Fischl here, and then you're generating good energy for your Yoimiya, as well as adding a little bit of crowd control with Beto because her elemental burst can bounce off of different enemies there. And not to mention, if you have C2 Beto, she's providing a much needed shield, which is incredibly important for your Yoimiya, and we're actually going to be talking about that next. So as I mentioned, shields are incredibly important on Yoimiya, and this is because we need to get off our actual combo, and that is because her third and fifth hit deal the most damage, so you want those to be vaporizing as much as possible, and if you get interrupted, then you're just straight up losing a lot of damage. So a strong shield is important, so you're not really going to be able to use Jinyan here, unfortunately, because her shield just really isn't that strong. So strong shield characters like Zhongli, Thoma, and Diona are all phenomenal choices. Thoma is great, especially since his shield can be reapplied via his elemental burst, and therefore even if the shield goes away, you're just going to get another one, which is fantastic. Zhongli, of course, being phenomenal because he provides shred, his shield is incredible, and if you pair your Yoimiya with Yunjin, then you're getting the Geo Resonance bonus, Enduring Rock here, which just increases your damage as well, which is awesome. And then Diona is a really good choice, especially if you have her at C6, because she provided some much needed elemental mastery and provides a shield and is a healer, which is a lot in one package, and also, you know, conserves stamina and all that jazz. Diona's a phenomenal option. She's going to allow you to occasionally melt too if you just so happen to freeze somebody by accident. It's definitely not a priority, but she certainly does contribute to the team. And you can also put Sacrificial Bow on her to pocket another shield whenever you need it for your Yoimiya. So all around, these are probably my top picks for shielders for your Yoimiya. Now there are of course other pairings and pretty darn interesting team comps that you can fit in your Yoimiya, and as I mentioned before, I'm going to be making a separate video about those team compositions, so stick around to the channel and subscribe if you're enjoying this kind of content and want to see the future content like the team composition for Yoimiya. Alright, next up we'll do a little bit of showcasing here. We're probably going to be vaporizing a boss or two, or maybe doing some Floor 12 Spiral Abyss. Actually haven't decided before the, you know, time of recording here, but we'll figure it out. It's really not that big a deal, and then we'll come back here for our conclusions on Yoimiya overall. All right, that's going to be about it for the video, and overall, yeah, Yoimiya is a phenomenal unit, and she's only gotten better with additions like Yunjin and Yelan, and characters like Thoma are really nice. She just does really solid damage, and she can vaporize single targets extremely quickly. It is a ton of fun, and honestly, she's also very easy to play. Just left clicking as much as possible is a very easy play style, and I really enjoy it in particular. But let me know if this helped you out in your Yoimiya building journey, and if you're enjoying her yourself. But other than that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and an extra special thanks to those of you who made it to the tail end of the video. And I'll make sure I see you guys in the next video. Peace.